H in there after my Louise.
Oh, all right.
That's why.
That's very nice. That's
Yes.
very nice. Welcome to the Big Questions podcast, where we talk about love, death, sex, religion, and all the big questions worth asking. I'm your host, Robert K. Elder, and today we're talking at Northwestern University with Professor of Religion, Cristina Traina. The Big Questions is sponsored by Shure, purveyors of professional microphones and headphones. Check them out at shure.com. That's SHURE.com. And the Big Questions podcast is part of Sun Times Media Local's podcast network. Christy, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, so I'm going to mispronounce the name of this lovely building. Tell me the name of the center.
This is the Shiel Catholic Center.
The Shiel Catholic Center. And that is apropos because we are talking about sainthood. In fact, not just sainthood, but the direction of the church, the evolution of the church. But I'm most interested in the politics of sainthood because it seems to have two functions, a spiritual function and a political function. And we just had two popes canonized at the same time. So can you talk about that a little bit? What is the spiritual and then the political function of sainthood?
Well, the spiritual function of sainthood is pretty easy and pretty brief. It's to lift up people as examples, whether they're examples of prayer, examples of activity in the world, examples of leadership, examples of scholarship, whatever they may be examples of for the faithful to follow, right? So we have exemplars lifted up in the saints, and we are sure or we are imagine that these people are in heaven with God, and so we want to follow their lead. And also, historically, there was another purpose that saints served. They still serve it, but maybe not so much in North America as in other places. They were intercessors with God. So the idea was if you could talk to the saint had God's ear, you might be able to have your prayer answered, have a favor granted through the intercession of the saints.
Right, and that seems to be a Latino thing, right? There's a lot of idolatry to the saints. Is that part of it?
I don't think I would say idolatry, because idolatry would mean saint worship, right? Officially,
I still think that applies, but go ahead.
Officially, nobody worships saints.
Right.
Whether that might happen in fact, whether someone might think of the saint as the highest power is another question, right? But officially, people venerate saints.
All right.
And they talk to saints or they pray through saints. Officially, they don't pray to saints.
Right.
However, in practice, that line might not be
There's
observed.
a lot of candles. I'm just saying
There are a lot
of very
candles.
specific candles.
Yeah, not just in Latino Catholicism, in my own background in Italian Catholicism as well. There are lots of candles.
Right. Well, I mean, the Virgin Mary also serves that function as well. You pray to the Virgin and the same sort of
right, exactly.
venerate the
She
Virgin.
is the most effective intercessor in Roman Catholicism, traditionally.
And the political function, we talked a little bit about this before, and I was just reminded of this. I was in the Czech Republic, and there was some talk about this, and traditionally one of the ways that the church would gain a foothold in the culture would be to canonize or make saints local figures. And is that a fair assessment?
I think that's true, and it's still going on today, right? Because for a long time, most of the saints of the church were somehow attached to Europe or the ancient Middle East, right? And when John Paul II came to the pontificate, one of the things that he did was canonize a lot of saints who were from outside of Europe. And that's continuing in the present, right? We're having saints canonized who are Native Americans. We're having saints canonized who were from Asia, right? So the idea is to represent the global spread of the church, the global presence of the church, and the global presence of holy people in the church.
Other folks who are sort of in that pipeline, there are currently 124 Korean martyrs,
Right.
813 Italians. Pope Paul VI is also, again, in that beatified pipeline. One of the things I was fascinated by, I was an altar boy, is I thought that the way you became a saint was you had 2 miracles observed, and that was part of your process. But you told me something that was very different. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Well, before Pope John Paul II, you needed to have 2 miracles to be beatified and then 2 more miracles after the beatification to be made a saint.
Right.
Pope John Paul II cut that in half, one for beatification and one for sainthood. Of course, martyrdom has always been a way to advance directly to sainthood without having
that's
to
the
pass.
fast track.
Yes,
that's
yes,
the fast track.
right,
Okay.
right.
Okay.
And I think that one of the reasons for this is that some of the miracles that were formerly popular for elevating someone to the post of the saint were kind of icky. Right? For instance, if a saint's blood liquefied on their saint's day, that might be one of the miracles. Or one that's even been proposed for Archbishop Oscar Romero is that his internal organs, his viscera, didn't harden up during the couple of years following his death, that they remained soft, pliable, and looking as if they had just been removed from his body. Those kinds of miracles are not ones that people who've been educated in universities, for instance, tend to really find compelling and comfortable.
Yeah, but like you can get a whole CSI series out of that. But, like, it's pretty amazing.
Could, but much preferred these days are unexplained medical healings, right? Those tend to be what come up these days.
So coming back to the political function, what was Pope Francis signaling by canonizing these two very different popes at the same time?
Well, that's an interesting question, and it's one that keeps us both in work, right? Because the Vatican never tells you exactly. I'm going to backtrack a minute and say, interestingly, that when John Paul II beatified John the 23rd, that is, raised him to the level just below sainthood, on that very same day, he beatified Pius IX, who was a pope known for things like kidnapping little Jewish children who might have been baptized to ensure that they would be raised by Christians. Okay, so we had a very conservative pope beatified at the same time that we had what was seen as a very liberal pope beatified. So I think that in some way Francis is following John Paul II's example and beatifying or canonizing two people who are seen as diametrically opposed theologically. So one thing that you might say that he's doing is ensuring that the conservative wing of the church and its interpretation of the Second Vatican Council is kept on the podium with John the 23rd. More charitably, you might say that what he's trying to do is make room in the church for very diverse voices.
Mm-hmm. Each saint is a patron saint of something, and I heard that you have a very interesting job for John Paul II. So what's your suggestion?
For John Paul II?
Yeah.
I'm trying to remember what I said.
I believe you said he should be the patron saint of sex.
I think that, yes. In fact, that suggestion I did make, and I think really he should, because he wrote one of the most flowery accounts of sex that you could possibly imagine in one of his books. And then he wrote several short pieces that were accumulated into a very long book on sexuality and the body. So yes, in fact, he should be the patron saint of sex.
Mm-hmm. And what are the complications there, though?
What are the complications there? He is...
Because, you don't think of, like, sexy popes, but so I'm asking you to defend your position.
No. He himself, probably we wouldn't think of as an exemplar of sex, or we hope he wasn't. In fact, they probably have explored very carefully into his personal life, since he has been canonized, to ensure that he wasn't practicing that particular thing during the time that he was ordained. However, one of the challenges of that is that he reifies marital sex and has an interesting theology in which masculinity and femininity are complementary in a very abstract kind of way, right? So that all women represent the eternal feminine, all men represent the eternal masculine, and they can unite in complete self-gift, which is openness to procreation.
Yeah, he's
right?
a little rapturous about it as well.
Very.
Yeah.
Very. Yes, he is. Right. And that doesn't necessarily encompass all the kinds of sexual experiences and all the kinds of sexual impulses that human beings have and need to make some kind of religious meaning out of.
Mm-hmm. One of the things that, you've been a champion of is marriage equality and why Catholics in particular should support it. Is that part of the evolution of the church? Because I think we've seen some movement, at least lip service, Pope Francis saying, who am I to judge, basically. What's your take on that? What's the direction we're going?
Well, we have to remember that when we're talking about the Roman Catholic Church's direction, we need to take our vitamins and think in terms of centuries, okay? Because very often when people ask about trends, they're asking about trends that are immediate, right? What will happen next month, right? Next month, the Roman Catholic Church is not going to say, gee, we support gay civil marriage. They're not going to do that. Right. But what I think is the case is that Roman Catholicism has expanded its understanding of human rights significantly over a long period of time. Right. And the right to marry is one of the civil rights that we are talking about. And it has also begun to understand sexuality differently over time. Before we got to Paul VI, who may also be canonized soon, right? The idea that people would have sex for unitive reasons in order to unite with each other better, to have a good relationship, right?
We're talking about intimacy.
Intimacy, right. I'm using Catholic speak,
yeah,
right?
Yeah.
Intimacy.
No, I'm going to go home and tell my wife unitive. We need some unitive time.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Right. The idea that would be on par with procreation didn't occur until 1968 in any official Catholic teaching, right? So the intimacy and element of sexuality is rising in relation to the procreative element of sexuality in Roman Catholic thought. And it's likely that sometime pretty soon it's going to surpass it, right? The other thing that's happening is that Roman Catholics, although they still do make up 50% of the world's Christians, really are only about 17% of the world's population. So it's pretty unlikely that Roman Catholics will be able to carry the day in civil law, right? And they haven't in many other topics that they're concerned about. And so it's pretty likely that very soon Roman Catholics will be able to accept and deal with the idea of same-sex marriage, because same-sex marriage is, after all, being proposed as a civil function, not a religious one. It's going to take Roman Catholics a very long time to get to the point of accepting same-sex marriage as a sacrament.
Sure. So that's like Vatican III or IV.
Right.
That's a lot of change, And you wrote, very insightfully about this for the Huffington Post last year, and you've continued to write editorials about it. And I was really interested. I was looking at the comments, and one of the people was saying, sort of very carefully, but it was an interesting point. And this person said, "What you really need to ask yourself is, why does the church care about this in the first place?"
Why does the church care about this in the first place? Well, first of all, most religious traditions are very good at gathering moss. Okay, so when a particular period in history comes up and they install a tradition to deal with that, right, it becomes part of the essential core of the tradition. So marriage is part of that in Roman Catholicism. It wasn't always a sacrament in Christianity. It was installed as a definitive sacrament pretty late in Catholic history, right? And so that's probably one reason it cares. The other reason I think that people care about this is that marriage has somehow become Roman Catholics' current signal about cultural difference. At different periods in history, groups pick different items to focus on. So all of them have had recently to do with sex, by the way, right? In the 1970s and 1980s, it was abortion. Now it seems to be marriage. So some item that Catholics focus on in order to distinguish themselves from the rest of the pack, from the culture at large. And I think the Catholic Church itself has focused on marriage, the Catholic hierarchy, I should say.
But why so, I guess, for lack of a better term, sexually obsessed? Even Francis was saying, like, hey, listen, our attention is wrong. It should be on social justice issues. So even the pontiff is saying, hey, our focus is wrong. So why do you think that obsession?
I think that obsession has one root, and that is that it is very easy to tell. Usually, now when we're talking, at least for heterosexual sex, it's very easy to decide whether somebody has had sex or not, right? It's a black and white yes or no issue, right? Most other important issues in society are not black and white issues, right? Abortion was nice because it was a black and white issue, right? But most other important issues, like how to eliminate poverty, right? How to deal with cultural diversity, right? How to deal with immigration, right? None of those, you can say that you want justice on all those counts, but frankly, it's very difficult to come up with a political solution that people can unanimously get behind. And so when we're talking about a public political presence, it's much easier to deal with issues of very personal sexual ethics, right, than it is to deal with these larger social issues in public.
Well, and you have a very interesting household. Your husband is a Lutheran minister.
That's right.
And you have two grown children who've wandered over into Methodists, right? Is that right?
I have 3 children, all of whom wandered over to the Methodists, which they don't really understand is extremely funny, given Methodist history and how strict Methodists were, you know, no cards, no drinking, no dancing. Right. And that's where my children went to be rebellious, was to the Methodists.
Well, that used to be the joke about, what was it, about Wheaton College is, you know, why was there no sex on campus? Because they were afraid that dancing was going to break out.
Right.
Yeah. So one of the things that is fascinating about you is you identify as gay. Is that right?
Right.
Right. And so so let me ask a very fundamental question is, did your struggle with sexuality, how did it overlap with your struggle with religion? Because especially the Roman Catholic Church, they have very strong opinions about being gay.
Right. And interestingly, I didn't have a big religious struggle about it. One of the reasons is that I grew up in a very strangely wonderful Catholic community as a child, in which people had home masses and they made burlap banners for every important occasion, and everybody planned liturgy together, right? And we read the Giving Tree.
I suggested that any burlap means you're a cult,
right?
Yeah, any burlap at all, and poster board. Oh,
well, and I should be concerned about that because, and this is speaking quite seriously. Sure. It turned out that the otherwise quite wonderful priest at the center of this was also a pedophile and also preyed on our community. So that was also part of my growing up. But what was interesting about my growing up was that that, in my opinion, the church was the community. The church was the people that were gathered around, celebrating Mass, interested in each other's lives, helping each other's children grow up, dealing with each other's griefs, right? And figuring out how to do these things. Yeah, there was a priest there, but really most of it was on us, right? And so when I decided to come out, my church was still my community. And in fact, there are members of that community, supportive community here today, and listening to our conversation. So,
but I'm interested in, you remain married. And, your husband's very involved in, the religious community as well. How does that work?
How does that work? That's an interesting question. Well, one of the important elements to how this works for me is that I somehow went and became a Roman Catholic ethicist, right? So I got all kinds of tools for analyzing the church's teaching and other theologians. And so I had all kinds of equipment for thinking about how you could be gay and Catholic at the same time that most other people don't have.
Right, but how can you be gay, Catholic, and married to a man? I think that's my central question.
Well, gay, Catholic, and married to a man, it's because we had a long, wonderful relationship all the way along. We've raised children together. We're very close to each other. We're big promoters of each other's worlds and activities. And there's no way that I ever wanted to be separated from him, right? It wasn't the question of, oh, gee, I want a divorce, right? It is, how do I manage to be a lesbian and be married to a man, right? And that has been the journey. But it's been important for me to surround myself with really wonderful women who are of various sexual orientations, right? And who are wonderful supports. And that has been just key, right?
But then why stay in the Roman Catholic Church? Because there are plenty of other denominations who are more understanding. I think, again, one of the Huffington Post commentators said, why don't you just call yourself Episcopalian at this point?
That's what my kids wonder as well. Mom, why are you Catholic? Right? This is the question. Well,
you and Anne Rice, if both of you could.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, because after a certain point, you look around and you say, well, they don't really need an ethicist who thinks it's okay to be gay in the Episcopalian Church, except though they might in Nigeria, but they don't in the United States, right? But in the United States, they still might, right? So I hang out here for that reason, right?
So has it changed from within? Is that what you're advocating?
Yes.
Okay.
I'm advocating change from within because change from without generally ends up being fracture, right? And there are a lot of things that I really value about my religious tradition, which I wouldn't want to lose. Right.
Well, and one more question about this, and that is, like, how did you make your children understand this? Like, how did you come out to your children? How did that work?
Awkwardly. Yeah. Yeah. Don't do this when your children are teenagers. I don't advise it. Not a good idea, right? And they've sort of wondered why we continue our life as we have, but since it's been a while, they've decided it's probably fine.
Well, and I want to come back to, again, the religious part, because they have, sort of spread out. Do you think that's typical? Because, I personally, I know more former Catholics than I know Catholics.
I think it's very typical. People spread out from religion right now a lot. I think that it's not just Catholics who would say that their children aren't in church, right? Their adult children aren't in church. It's a lot of people. And I think it partly has to do with voluntarism. It partly has to do with the kind of press they see about the church. Because if I looked at the press about the Roman Catholic Church, I wouldn't want to be Roman Catholic either, right? That's the only reason. And I think many of them don't. There are many people who do come back to church once they are of an age to either be sick or have children. And I am not trying to be a functionalist here, and I'm not trying to be cynical here. I think it's that many people come back to a religious tradition, not just a Christian one, but any religious tradition, once they realize that there is a depth of community, a depth of spirituality, a depth of meaning that they need to connect to.
Sure.
Right.
But what about, again, this has always sort of fascinated me, people who come back after being very critical. So Anne Rice came back for a little while. There was a cartoonist named John Callahan who was very critical and then sort of re-embraced Catholicism. And they're always suspected of intellectual dishonesty because the church was something that brought them comfort as a child. And then after sickness or children or sometimes death, that reconnects people with church.
Here's what I think. I think that Roman Catholics and the Eastern Orthodox also fall into this basket. Roman Catholics are very good at mystery. And I think when people come back to any religious tradition that has a very deep, mysterious element of mystery in it, they're often coming back because they realized that the intellectual and rational side of them is not all that they need to feed in the religious tradition, right? That at some point they need something else. I'm thinking about Dorothy Day here, right? The founder of the Catholic worker movement. She was a socialist. She was a communist. She had an abortion. She was married once officially, once unofficially. She had a child. And she was suddenly attracted by the deep and mysterious elements of Catholic worship. And against her own will almost, she felt, right, became Roman Catholic and then managed to harness all of her reforming energy within Roman Catholicism, right? And she would have said herself that it wasn't a rational argument that brought her to faith. It was the sense of the depth of mystery and meaning within Roman Catholic liturgy that brought her back.
And this is the C.S. Lewis argument as well. This is mere Christianity. He was sort of brought back, although, again, he bends over backwards, to make religious arguments. I think sometimes very unsuccessfully.
He does.
Yeah.
He does. He tries to argue people into the church in that book.
Yes. Sometimes very eloquently, but again, intellectually, it's hard for that to hold water. And the reason I'm following this line of questioning is, as a professor, as someone in academia, is it hard to be religious in academia?
It's a challenge, right? Those two communities don't always overlap. My students find it hard to be religious and be studying Christianity, actually, sometimes. And that's important to develop multiple levels of dealing with the faith. At one level, you're analyzing it, sorting it, figuring out causes and effects, and at another level, you're practicing. And does that mean that you're sometimes practicing self-critically, or that sometimes you begin to feel you're chasing your tail? Occasionally, of course.
Or chasing your heart.
Or chasing your heart. Right. Exactly. But it's inevitable.
So what keeps you, what thing are you chasing then? What keeps you here? What if it's not your tail and not your heart, what are you chasing?
What am I chasing? I'm chasing the opportunity to live a fully self-emptying life that also realizes the qualities that I believe that God implanted in me.
And what are those qualities?
I always think other people know them better than I do. I hope that I can think straight about theology.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, I mean, it was really interesting. I just watched a speech you gave here not too long ago, and you talk about where you align with Pope Francis. And one of them was in a recent writing where he sort of celebrates faith. Faith is like standing in God's unshakable love and looking at people the way God does.
Yes.
Can you explain what you mean by that and why you find that appealing?
Well, the experience of standing in a love or a sense of power that is so complete and so unimaginably infinite that you have the love and energy to be charitable and kind and well-wishing and see the best in all people around you, right? So that you can behave toward them as you imagine God sees them, right? That would really be, for me, the pinnacle, I think. And I also stand with Francis in believing that in the end, what matters is how we treat people at the margins of society, in the end. And I haven't moved myself far enough in that direction. And I think that's the most challenging and frightening thing Francis has to say. And I think that North America hasn't fully absorbed that either.
And I think that brings us to the end. I think that's a good place to leave. You have been listening to the Big Questions podcast. We are part of the Sun-Times Media Local Podcast Network. Our music is by Hernan Sanchez. Christy, thank you so much.
Thank you.